Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Dark Reading webinar, Cloud Security Threats Enterprises Need to Watch, sponsored by Beyond Trust and broadcast by Informa. I'm Sarah Peters, Senior Editor with Dark Reading, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This webinar is designed to be interactive. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media outlets, and participate in the Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You may also download a copy of the slides via the resources widget. Toward the end of our webinar, we'll ask you to complete our survey found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a minute to fill this out before leaving us today, as your feedback will provide us with valuable information on how we can improve future events. And lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please click the Help widget found at the bottom of your screen or type your issue into the Q&A area, and we'll be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. And now on to the presentation, Cloud Security Threats Enterprises Need to Watch. Discussing today's topic are John Burke and Jonas Outlaw. John Burke is a Senior IT Security Engineer for Iberia Bank. A graduate of Auburn University, John has more than 20 years of experience in IT, working in banking and healthcare technology risk systems, as well as managing security for other disciplines. He's a certified computer forensics examiner, certified web application penetration tester, and a certified ethical hacker. And Jonas Outlaw is Senior Product Manager at Beyond Trust and works with a variety of stakeholders in the product development lifecycle to help drive product direction and enhancements. Jonas brings more than a decade of experience to Beyond Trust in various aspects of application development, systems engineering, and product management. And prior to joining Beyond Trust, Jonas was a systems engineer at a large life insurance company. He received his MBA with a concentration in Management of Information Systems from Mississippi College. So I'm really excited to have both of them here today. I think it's going to be a great presentation. John is going to take it away first. So John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Again, my name is John Burke, and good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. I just want to thank everybody, first of all, for joining today. Like Sarah said, I've been in the IT industry for 20 years now, and it's hard to believe it's been that long, honestly. I've been in the financial sector, the IT security space, for over 12 years now. Like many folks in the industry, do a little bit of consulting on the side, pen testing, etc., and try to stay busy with also answering the phone when my parents forget their Gmail password. I'm sure many of you can relate to that. My father is in his 70s now, and he writes all of his passwords down on a notebook next to his computer. And but he puts no context to the password, so the hacker, the bad guy that will break into his house, will not know what the passwords are for, and unfortunately neither does he. So before we get started, I just wanted to say please ask questions. We've got a dialog box in the webinar screen there. Please submit any questions at any point during the presentation, and we will get them to them at the end of the webinar. All right, let's get started. The cloud security can be intimidating for many reasons, but I think the main reason people find it intimidating is because it's hard to pin down exactly what you need to secure. Each service is different and implements their security stack differently. On top of that, SaaS, IaaS, and PaaS, so software as a service, infrastructure as a service, and platform as a service services are constantly making changes. And like on-premise environments, the threat landscape is constantly changing. But now, in the cloud environment, instead of changing at a speed that you're aware of because it's within your walled garden, changing at a lightning speed, and somebody else is making those changes for you. almost like trying to secure the Wild West. So how can your cloud presence be secured? And how do you identify threats you need to watch? Well, the answer to the first question is yes, you can secure your cloud presence. Obviously, major companies would not be moving to the cloud as quickly as they are if they couldn't secure the cloud environment. Microsoft, for example, now has very few facilities with access to their corporate internal network. Most Microsoft facilities that you go to only have internet access for their employees. Most of the access that's provided to those employees are cloud hosted. Now, I know Microsoft is also pushing their Azure services hard, but they're also one of the most attacked companies in the world. So if they're able to secure their cloud presence, then everybody else should be able to as well. So Microsoft security is I know, somewhat of a joke sometimes. Not a joke, but people will snicker when they say Microsoft. Microsoft security is often the reason we have jobs. But I do think they're making vast improvements in the security space, and they're providing a very good example for how to secure your cloud presence. So in this webinar, we will do a good bit of emphasis on Azure and Office 365 because a lot of companies are moving down that path right now. A lot of enterprises, a lot of you on this webinar probably are either in the process of reviewing Office 365 or Azure, or have in the middle of implementing it, or have fully implemented it. We'll also talk about Azure Web Services, Amazon AWS, and a little bit about Google. Both of those environments are very similar, but the approach to all of this is going to be similar whether you're looking at Azure, AWS, or Google. Okay, so how do we identify the threats that we need to watch? Like on-premise environments, a layered security approach is what works best, and for both protecting and identifying the threats. A lot of organizations are adopting a model in the cloud that you see on your screen, and you'll have there are 5 very broad categories of things that we'll discuss in today's webinar. I've heard them called categories, layers of security, pillars of security. They all kind of fit very similar to what you've been doing on premise for a while. So we'll touch on each one, talk about some of the threats that we're seeing in each category, give some examples and some ways to mitigate those threats. All right, so the 5 categories we have on the screen here: identity and access management is probably the one we'll spend the most time on. Certainly the #1 threat that we see attacked in the enterprise or in the cloud environment. Configuration management, enterprise segmentation, application and platform vulnerability assessment, and then runaway cloud expenses we'll touch on briefly. So obviously this doesn't cover all of our threats. It'd be a very long webinar if we were going to cover all of the threats. This is just kind of a trying to break it down to where we can identify each layer, each category of threat, and then give some examples and talk about what's really important in each one. So with that, we'll move on to our first category, identity and access management. This is definitely the #1 threat to cloud-based applications for obvious reasons. You get credentials, you're into the environment. Pen testers routinely test and successfully bypass authentication to common services such as Office 365, Salesforce, Google's G Suite. This is usually due to the service being configured incorrectly, but the issue is, or not being configured at all. But the issue is not limited to software as a service. Platform and infrastructure of a service are at an even greater risk. The applications running in those environments are often custom-written applications, and they may be vulnerable to authentication attacks due to poorly implemented authentication methods. So what do we look for? We're going to focus on Active Directory in our discussion, just because that's the platform that most people are using. A lot of this can be used in the Google environment as well, but Active Directory is really the main one that most enterprises are using these days. And like a lot of organizations, you may have Active Directory on-prem only. You may have kind of a hybrid setup of Active Directory where some of it's been being synced to the cloud for ADFS or other usage. And then you may be totally in the cloud, Azure AD, what's called modern authentication. So common attacks on Active Directory, traditional attack would be the brute force attack. The more common one now is password spraying and, of course, phishing attacks. Phishing attempts have been around for quite a while. Most of us are very familiar with how phishing attempts work, and I'm sure many of you probably test your employees on phishing. And we're not really going to go over it too much because it is something that's, it's an obvious threat. It is something that we see a lot of, but it's also a very familiar attempt. What I wanted to talk about today was password spray attacks. So they're becoming more common, and if you're not familiar with a password spray attack, it's basically taking a small list of commonly used passwords, something like Winter 2020, something that would match the complexity rules that you have set up in your Active Directory, and attempting those passwords on multiple accounts. So it's kind of the inverse of a brute force attack, where you try a long list of passwords against a single account. In this case, you get a list of the users, the organization's usernames or email addresses in the case of Office 365 and Azure Active Directory. You get this long list of the corporation's email addresses, and you attempt the short list of passwords that you have against that long list of usernames. The trick is, to go low and slow so that you don't get picked up by the organization's security tools, and you go slow enough that low enough that you don't get locked out as you're attempting these passwords. Chances are somebody in the organization has used one of these commonly used passwords, and you'll be able to use their credentials to get in. Now, the reason this is commonly used in Azure, in the Azure environment, is because it's using email addresses as the username. And email addresses are very commonly harvested in various ways. You can get them from even a LinkedIn profile, poorly configured legacy IMAP server or email server or something like that. So how do you protect against a spray attack like that? Microsoft announced at its annual Ignite 2019 conference this past November, that 99% of password spray attacks can be mitigated by enabling MFA correctly. Now, it seems like a silver bullet, seems like an easy thing. Just go enable MFA, and you will not have any password spray attacks. Well, the key to that is correctly enabling MFA. MFA can be poorly implemented very easily, or organizations can have legacy applications that either don't support MFA or are using an older ADFS for authentication. But moving to what Microsoft calls the modern authentication method, which is kind of their umbrella term for services that use Azure AD cloud authentication methods, is key to implementing MFA correctly. That using that method and kind of deprecating the old ADFS authentication methods in your environment is a big step towards getting MFA implemented correctly. There's even a way, it's not used commonly, but you can use MFA as the primary authentication method in a lot of cases. So if you get, the first thing you do is authenticate via MFA, and then the username and password would come later. It's not a very common configuration, but it's very effective. Now, some of you may recall a few months ago there was a Azure MFA implementation, a security flaw in that implementation that allowed bypass of MFA rules. So it was a vulnerability on the Azure side. So we'll cover this topic a little bit later, but that kind of issue is something that you will constantly see in the cloud. You are dependent on their implementation of even the best security stack. You're at their mercy. So, but still, enabling MFA is the best way to go for this, and we'll talk about some other options. One of the things that can be done to prevent or to handle security flaws like this is to use a third-party identity platform. So something like Beyond Trust, it can greatly assist in securing accounts, particularly admin accounts and sensitive accounts. Not only can these tools ensure a proper MFA implementation, they're very good tools for managing access within the environment, particularly privileged access management type accounts. Another option that is really gaining ground, and I think we'll see a lot in the next year or so, is going completely passwordless, using FIDO tokens for authentication into the platform. So you can use a FIDO token. If you're not familiar with a FIDO token, it's basically like a USB stick that would use something you have, which is the token, and something you are, which would be your biometric thumbprint or something like that, for authentication into the cloud service. FIDO stands for Fast Identity Online, if you're wondering what FIDO stands for. So FIDO tokens are really kind of taken off as a way to mitigate password issues. There is an investment. FIDO tokens do cost money because they're a piece of hardware, but they are not too terribly expensive. So they're a good alternative to password-only authentication. All right, so we have enabled modern authentication. We've got MFA and FIDO tokens and a third-party privileged access manager in your environment. So you're thinking you're good, right? Well, you probably are. But the next step would be monitoring what's going on in your environment. Your security operations team or an equivalent group should be monitoring and alerting when detected malicious activity is going on in your environment. Tools such as CASB, which is a cloud access security broker, or in the case of Microsoft, they have their own CASB offering, which is CAS, Cloud Access Security, because Microsoft likes to have different names for some of their platforms. Cloud App Security has really turned into a very good product and competing well with some of the other CASBs out there. But those tools will help you and the security team detect things like password spray attacks, anomalous activity, login attempts from foreign or hostile nations. There's a lot of information that you can get from a CAS or a CASB tool. They can also help identify other cloud applications. So if your employees are using other cloud tools that may or may not be sanctioned, something that you want used within your environment, the old shadow IT terminology, you can use a CASB tool to identify those applications, and you can use CASB to help secure those applications and identify applications that may need to use some sort of authentication protocol like Azure AD or something like that. So CASB is a great tool that a lot of them also feed into SIEM tools so that you can have a NOC or a security operations team really looking at that information. So that pretty much covers the identity and access management. It's a big space. Like I said, we were going to spend the most time on that one because it is the most important and most commonly accessed threat out there. It's definitely the number one thing you need to keep an eye on. Make sure that it's configured correctly. And the walkaway is always MFA, MFA, MFA. It's going to help you mitigate more risks than anything else out there, and properly implemented. All right, so we're going to go to the next slide here, and this kind of touches on the authentication issues as well. So configuration management is something that is very hard to deal with in a cloud environment, and it's something that if you don't keep an eye on it, something can run away from you and expose your corporate data. So the complexity around the configuration for cloud services can really expose your organization to maybe your digital assets and confidential data out into the world. In our previous example, MFA example, modern authentication is not a simple switch to enable. So, I kept stressing the configuration of it must be done correctly, or malicious actors are going to figure out a way to get around it. So it's not just MFA for SaaS offerings like Office 365. AWS can host countless applications and configurations. Improperly configured storage buckets, for example, can expose your organization data. And in the security world of the financial industry, if many of you remember last year, the hack at Capital One, it's often referred to as the gift that keeps on giving, because so many times you can reference back to it on things. Of course, some of the gift from that hack was good and some was bad. It's definitely bad if you were a Capital One employee. But it gives us a very good example of how dangerous an improperly configured cloud environment can be. They've been a great example of a company that is cloud first in everything that they do. All of its applications and environment a lot of it's cloud-based. So they're a good example of what you can do, but they're also a good example of what can happen if things don't go wrong. So if you'll recall, the hack involved an Amazon employee taking advantage of a misconfigured WAF, web application firewall. It was not configured in a way, it was configured in a way that allowed an intruder to relay requests to a key back-end AWS resource that handles, among other things, credentials sent from a security service to access any resource in the AWS cloud. The misconfiguration allowed those credentials to have too many permissions, and using the credentials, the attacker was able to list all the files in certain S3 buckets. Those buckets happen to contain credit applications for Capital One customers. So leaving a lot of details out because you really can get lost in the weeds pretty quick with how that particular hack happened. But the takeaway from it is that you really have to know how all of this is configured in order to protect it correctly. The person, the hacker that was the Amazon employee, really had to know a lot of detail, a lot of moving parts about how AWS works. So they needed to know, how the AWS infrastructure works, how S3 storage buckets are navigated, how Amazon's identity and access management works, how the mod security WAF worked. So all of that translates to how somebody in your organization really needs to know before you implement AWS or Azure or Google, how all of this works, how each component of it works, and how it should be secured as well. So service providers, and that's really the challenge in all this, service providers may not fully implement, or they may poorly implement key configuration items. They are subject to vulnerabilities too, which is the case here in the AWS example. But like we said before, there are key vulnerabilities, and not implementing it correctly can cause all sorts of MFA or authentication bypass, or access to data within storage buckets within some of these service providers. So let's see what else we have here. So service providers, another issue that service providers have is hosted applications on the IaaS and the PaaS side, so on the infrastructure and platform side. Applications can often contain vulnerabilities and flaws in their code. Pen testers will often find and exploit holes in custom applications, and so you should always have these applications tested. We'll talk about that a little bit in one of our later slides, but having custom applications tested is very important, especially when they're running in these cloud environments. Finally, the configuration management section, there are some new companies out there now that are helping organizations to make sure that their AWS and cloud environments are secured and configured correctly. They can be a good resource for helping you make sure that your cloud infrastructure, especially for critical assets, is secured correctly. All right, I think configuration management is getting ready to move on to the next slide. All right, enterprise segmentation. This is a little old school because enterprise segmentation has been around for a very long time. The goal here is to replicate what you've been doing on-prem into your cloud environment. So some of you may only have, a gateway firewall, maybe a DMZ, maybe a very simplistic network on-premise. Some may have a very complex environment, may have multiple departments segregated out. You may have certain departments that can only access certain resources, and that's all great. When you move to the cloud, it's very easy to take your to just kind of throw things out in the cloud and hope that it's secure. So if you take a test or a dev environment, which is a great example for this, and because it's a very easy thing to do. Let's say a developer creates an environment within Google Cloud and they don't secure it properly. Usually dev accounts have a very high level of access. So oftentimes one of the biggest flaws is not segmenting that dev environment from the other environments. You can cause a lot of problems, obviously, from a security standpoint, but you can also cause problems from conflicts with your production environment by not segregating this. So best cases on enterprise segmentation is to containerize your risk, separate that production core from your dev and test. And use your traditional network segmentation and to segregate out your environment in the cloud. And I've got here, use web application firewalls. That is something that we see a lot of. Well, we've got a WAF out there, we're okay. It will protect us from everything. And as we saw in the AWS example above, that's not always the case. A WAF can be configured improperly. It may not. It may have a vulnerability in itself. So making sure that not to rely on that WAF 100% is very important. So use multi-layer segmentation methods as well. So that's all we're going to talk about for enterprise segmentation, because it really is something that you should be doing on-prem and just take it out to the cloud as well, but don't forget about it because it's something that's easily looked over. All right, so application and platform vulnerability assessment. Something that we are also seeing a good bit of. Custom code in an environment, in a cloud environment, is not often detected or not often tested in the same way that maybe a third-party web application is tested. One of the key things to do. Well, first of all, there's two different environments. The platform and application assessment is really handled differently for software as a service versus infrastructure as a service. On the software as a service side, first of all, following the best practices around the configuration of the service is key, obviously, but including the software, the SaaS environment in your annual testing. So let's say you do a pen test once a year, twice a year, once a quarter, or whatever. In your pen test, include the SaaS environment. Always test that environment as part of your pen testing, because we see a lot of companies don't include that in their pen test, and there could be some vulnerabilities within the way they have that SaaS service configured that go unnoticed. And then on the infrastructure and the platform as a service side, obviously your custom code or any applications, maybe it's a third-party application that you've moved out to the cloud to be hosted out there. Test those in the same way you would if they were on-prem, with a lot more scrutiny. But include them in all of your pen testing and your tests. Another recommendation that I always make is to build a test environment. So for Office 365, G Suite, AWS, Google, all of these cloud services, when you sign up for the service, get a test environment. We see a lot of companies that leave that out, and then they go to implement 365, for example, and they don't have any way to test changes or anything else that they're doing, and they end up leaving that out, and it can be a real problem. So we're about to run out of time here, so I'm going to kind of skip through this pretty quickly. Runaway expenses is something that is also an issue. Just it's something that we can touch on a little bit later, but it is an issue. It's not necessarily a security issue, but it can be something that not kept in check, it can run away from you. So, all right, and I believe being told we're running out of time. So I'm going to turn it over to Jonas now, and thank you guys for listening in.
Hey, thanks, John. That was really insightful to kind of going over those things. So again, my name is Jonas Outlaw, Senior Product Manager here at Beyond Trust. Appreciate everyone's time here today. So I want to go over a few things around some best practices around cloud security. But to start, we kind of need to understand the threat landscape. We really like this infographic at Beyond Trust, this privileged attack chain, because this really helps visualize how attacks occur. And it can apply to a traditional on-premises environment, but it also can apply to cloud as well. But really, first off, you have some type of threat actor, malicious employee, whoever, that's trying to gain access to something that they shouldn't have. So these could be insider threats if it's an employee with legitimate access to the perimeter or the network, where these systems are located. But you could also have external threats that are coming in outside of that perimeter. And so the goal is they want to get access to the environment, and from there they probably come in with some type of lower privileges, but then they want to escalate those privileges. The reason that they want to escalate the privileges is because that lets them move laterally across the environment. It allows them to find new things, find additional things that they can exploit. And ultimately, the overall goal for them is some type of data breach, some type of exploit of, basically your company data. This is not a fun day for anyone who's involved. As John mentioned earlier with Capital One breach, that was probably not a very fun day for those responsible for that environment. So now that we can understand, the overall attack chain, we need to understand how that surface is expanding. And so this can be with cloud, but it can also be with some of these other things that you're starting to see more of around DevOps or Internet of Things. So back in the on-premises day, you had to consider things like shared admin accounts or maybe server accounts, maybe machine credentials for app to app, and really that expands once you go out to cloud. So now you're having to manage those accounts around maybe the cloud platform itself with AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, maybe those other virtualized environments that you have, or this could even be some of those SaaS applications. Think of Facebook or LinkedIn and how important those are to your organization and to your brand. You don't want those accounts compromised. So as we move out to more Internet of Things devices, these are maybe your remote employees who have workstations that are moving all around. Maybe you've taken a BYOD policy and you're actually letting your employees bring those devices into your network. But then this can also be other things like cameras and sensors and printers and other things that are just connected. So as we move out to DevOps, now we're starting to talk about things like secrets that need to be managed. These environments are spinning up rapidly, spinning up and down. A lot of activity that's occurring where some of those existing utilities that you may have used to manage traditional server accounts, those may not scale very well in a DevOps type environment. So you need something that can really handle that level of change. So one thing I like to show to help people understand what's your responsibility in the cloud is the AWS shared responsibility model. So this model does a really good job. AWS provides this, and it shows basically AWS is saying on the bottom, these are the things that we're responsible for. We have to protect the regions. We have to protect our global infrastructure, the servers, the different things that are making up the storage, networking, things like that, and then the underlying software that runs the hundreds of services that AWS offers. So those are the things that they're responsible for in the security of those applications and those environments. And so what they want to point out above on the top in the blue in the customer model is these are the things that you're responsible for. And so you could think of this as, you want to ensure that you're keeping that operating system that's running in AWS, you want to keep it patched. Maybe you want to encrypt the hard disk or the storage that's being used by those systems. You want to encrypt the data that's in transit, and then protecting the access to those. So, and ultimately, what you could be storing is some type of customer data on there. And so really this is a great model. Whoever came up with this did a really good job just to help you quickly visualize kind of your responsibility. So really what I want to get across here is that, AWS, we use them as an example, but Azure, Google Cloud, and some of the other cloud providers, they're giving you a lot of tools to basically to secure your applications or your workloads that are running in their clouds. They're also doing a lot on their own to protect the cloud and overall infrastructure, but you still have a role there. So be sure you use those tools that they've made available to you. It's still, it's possible, again, as John pointed out on that S3 bucket that was left exposed, it's still possible to circumvent all of those great tools that they provide to you just by some, unintentional configuration changes. So let's dig into some other areas of security, just consideration. So all of these public clouds, things like AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, they all have basically a root level or a very highly privileged account. And from there, you can create sub-accounts and kind of segment access. But really what you should be doing is making sure that you're managing the access to those accounts. So you want to make sure that you know when someone is using it, you can audit it, you can see that the things that they access when they use that account. Those should be things that you're doing today. Really, those accounts just shouldn't be freely handed out without some level of visibility into them. The other thing that we like to promote is around ensuring that you're proxying access to those management consoles. And so what I mean by that is these consoles, like the AWS management console, it's exposed to the internet. You have to use an account to get access to it. But really, if it's exposed to the internet, you have internal employees who have access to it. What stops them from accessing that from their home? What do you know, even if they access it in your corporate environment, how do you know what they're doing when they're accessing those consoles? You get some level of logging that may occur from configuration changes. But what's interesting is if you proxy access to those consoles, then you can use those managed accounts to enable access to the console itself. So what we like to do is inject the credentials into those consoles, present the management consoles in a way that can be recorded. So if there was ever any need to go back and audit at exactly what happened, what was configured, what was changed in those consoles, that can be done. And really what we're trying to lower is that percentage of the breaches that can occur just by someone using those accounts and misusing them when they access those consoles. Next, you should ensure that the data is encrypted in transit and at rest. If you look at the bottom, the percentage or the quote there, 51% of organizations aren't encrypting their sensitive data in the cloud. And, a lot of these providers, like AWS and Azure, make this very simple to do. Like AWS has their KMS, Azure has Key Vault, and they have these pretty tightly integrated with their storage solution. So it's really simple to do that. And then, if you need to, some of them may offer ways to hook in if you have like an on-premises hardware security module or something like that, or just some other type of key management solution. They may provide hooks into that if you still want to keep those keys stored in your on-premises data center. And from a data in transit standpoint, let's encrypt. I mean, this is a pretty easy way to enable everything to have an SSL or TLS certificate, everything to ensure that data that you're transmitting is encrypted as well. So Let's Encrypt makes it really easy. So next up, really we need to reduce and limit the ports that are needed for remote access. And so, when you spin up a new Linux VM or a new Windows VM or guest and these clouds, most of them are relying on something like SSH for access or RDP for access. And so that means that they're opening those ports to the public, to the public internet. Of course, there's ways that you can isolate and segment who can, what networks those can be accessed from. But really, the other alternative for this is disabling all inbound access and relying on a solution that only requires outbound access for remote access. So basically, you're reversing that session in the way that it requires remote access to gain access to those systems. And so really, this is just another way that you can reduce and limit the exposure of those services that are exposed to the public internet. And I think John touched on this a little bit too, but you should be automating basically everywhere that's possible. And the goal here is just we're trying to remove that human error element. And if something can be automated, it probably should. It allows your organization to scale. It allows you to be really, highly efficient. And most of these providers have really rich APIs and toolkits that enable that level of automation. So we're trying to prevent some of those unintentional configuration changes that someone may have done. And really, it's just automation is a way, assuming your automation is good, it's a way that you can really remove that human error element. So let's take a look at some of those must-haves. And so this will be a little bit of a recap, but the one thing that you should be looking at if you're looking at either a public cloud, something like Azure, or even just an application, a SaaS-based application, is you should see if those controls of that vendor, if those are vetted by something, a third party, something like a SOC 2 audit. These are, this is pretty much table stakes. I would say that really what the SOC 2 audit shows is they have a good security practices around how they provide that access to you, how they store your data and things like that. So that's a good thing to check and see. For example, with Amazon, they have Artifact, and Artifact is a way where you can look up a lot of these security-related, white papers or audit reports and gain access to those. Next, be sure to look for a solution where you can manage credentials for the administrative access to that actual solution. So you want to be able to manage those credentials. That keeps, someone doesn't, it keeps your admins from having to, knowing that credential or having access to the credential directly. It creates that audit log that you need for when you're enabling access to those systems. And then, as we went over before, really access to those management consoles should be proxied. This allows you to limit access to them, and it also provides a nice audit log when it was accessed. And be sure to use those tools that are made available to you to encrypt data that's at rest and in transit. And I would look for solutions where you don't really, you're not having to use something that requires listening ports on these endpoints. So look for something that can make more outbound connections for remote access. And lastly, look for some of those. If you're using something like AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, look at some of those automation toolkits and APIs that are available. I mean, those are really rich, and they'll allow you to really scale your organization. Remove that human error element. And last, we do have our buyer's guide for privileged access management. So this is out here. Take a look at it. It gives you a lot of those things that you should be looking towards when you're looking at new PAM vendors. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Jonas. Wow, you guys did great. I wonder if we're even going to have any questions, because it seems like you guys answered all of the ones that we could possibly ask. But just in case, I'm going to remind the audience that to participate in Q&A, just type your question into the text box located to the right of the presentation window, or click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If we're not able to answer all submitted questions during today's webinar, we'll be sure to share them with the speakers who can reply to you offline. Also, before we do today's Q&A, I'd also ask you to direct your attention to the webinar survey, which is available at the right of the presentation window. If you closed the survey, you can reopen the widget by clicking the icon along the bottom of your screen. Thanks in advance for doing that. Your participation in the survey does allow us to better serve you. Okay, gentlemen, I think one of the things that was interesting to me, just investigating this topic, and then also that I've noticed in your discussion, a lot of the I guess tools that are available to us to try to improve our cloud security are things that are now being offered to us by some of those main cloud vendors like AWS, Azure, and Google. But what if we have a multi-cloud environment? What, I guess, are some of our best options for making sure that we're kind of managing things across, for making sure that we're securing the interface for a cloud instance, regardless of what cloud we're using, or assuming that we're using a whole lot? I guess where are the holes going to be, and how can we better audit and control that? So if that question made sense, I'm going to direct it to you first, Jonas.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, some of the problems that you could run into is if you have multiple vendors, and each vendor doesn't have the same capability, and these are cloud vendors. And so I think part of this is just to ensure that you have kind of a vendor agnostic approach to how you provide access to these tools. And so the way, I'll give my pitch, the way that we do it is just by ensuring that we're able to manage some of those access to those accounts with the different vendors. And so the way that we can discover credentials that are used in AWS or Azure. But we also have something called WebJump, which is basically it's an embedded Chromium browser that we have in our product. And that's how we proxy that access to the management console. So from there, you're not really isolated or locked into a single vendor in which you can support from a cloud solution. So I'm sure if guys, did you want to touch on that? Anything you want to add?
The only thing I would add is making sure you have staff that can configure those consoles well. So are familiar with the tools, are familiar with the consoles and how to manage them and how to configure them correctly. I think it's very important too.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned earlier with the automate processes and to remove the human error is key, because these tools are so complicated. In a lot of cases, it's easy to miss a checkbox, miss a configuration item, and it can cause exposure that way.
Yeah, sorry guys, I dropped out there for a second. One of the things that you guys also spoke about was the shared responsibility model. And that's interesting to me as well, because it's one of the things that we've had readers on Dark Reading tell us is that the space right in between that shared responsibility is where they're having some challenges. There's certain things that are clearly the bailiwick of the cloud provider, and then things that are clearly the responsibility of the cloud user. But when it comes to a visibility standpoint, there are certain aspects of the environment, of the infrastructure, and therefore of the security that the cloud user doesn't necessarily, they don't have visibility into because they don't own the infrastructure. And that for some cloud users makes them worry about some of the security issues. It makes them worry about some of the security and privacy compliance issues. It raises some questions for them. So is that something that you guys have faced as well? And if so, what kind of solutions or mitigations do you offer for that? And John, I'll go to you with that one first.
Sure. So we actually see kind of both ends of it. Some folks are like, I don't care, it's the cloud, we're going to throw it out there, I'm sure it's fine. And then we have some people that are super paranoid about what they put out there. You know, it kind of depends on who you're working with. And surprisingly, it's not dependent on the data itself, but it's just the mentality of whoever is implementing it. One of the things that I always recommend is an organization create a cloud center of excellence or some sort of group or committee that reviews your cloud applications, particularly new ones, review some of the ones that you already have in place, and make sure that and use that group to discuss, you know, either the risks that are involved by moving to the cloud and having certain data out there, and then the ways it can be secured, and have that committee approve the cloud application before it's implemented, or you know, even after it's implemented in some cases.
That's great. Great advice. Jonas, if you're with us, I know you had some audio problems. Do you have anything to add to that, or just to the topic of visibility in general?
Yeah, I would, you know, kind of the thing that we always go back to is, you know, there's some level of trust that you have to have. So, you know, these, you know, very security mature, you know, don't want to call them security paranoid, you know, type customers, but what you have to think through is what level of controls does you know, the hosting provider have. So like AWS, for example, that's where I mentioned the SOC audit previously. You know, there's also things like ISO 27001 that really shows the controls of, you know, in this case for AWS, it's Amazon as an organization, and some of the controls that they have. But then, you know, we'll also look at things like the Cloud Security Alliance and see if they're members of those, just to really see what their posture is overall as a company. And that should give you a pretty good indication of, you know, how serious are they taking this, you know, you know, how critical do they view my data? And so that's just another thing I'd like to point out.
Well, thank you guys so much. It has been a pleasure having both of you with us today. I definitely learned a lot. So thank you, Jonas. And thank you, John. And thank you, of course, to our sponsor, Beyond Trust. Thank you. And thank you to all of you in the audience. We would not do this without you. I'm going to tell you that I've just thrown a bunch of links in front of you, and there's a lot of great resources there. So please check out all of the stuff on this thank you for attending slide, please. Within the next 24 hours, you're going to receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand, so you can watch it again and again and again. Feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who may not have been available to listen to the event today. This webinar is copyright 2020 by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Dark Reading and Beyond Trust, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. And on behalf of our guests, John and Jonas, and everybody at Dark Reading, I'd like to thank you again for joining us today. I'm Sarah Peters. We'll see you next time.